Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Tuesday, February 3rd, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 83.1 degrees, with a low dipping to 53.3 degrees. So enjoy the mild weather, but keep an eye on those evening chills. Coming up, we'll examine the motivations driving Russia's most intense strike against Ukraine right before scheduled peace discussions, and break down a federal judge's ruling that stopped the cancellation of temporary protected status for more than 350,000 Haitians. Plus, other key stories from around the world, including updates on global markets and local community impacts. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We begin this half hour with Ukraine, where Russia launched one of its biggest air assaults of the war overnight. Ethan is following the strikes and the fallout. Ethan, what did Russia do in the skies over Ukraine?
Overnight into this morning, Russia fired roughly 450 long-range drones and about 70 missiles, many of them ballistic, at targets across at least 5 to 8 regions. Ukrainian and Western outlets, including France 24 and the Associated Press, describe it as one of the largest barrages in nearly 4 years of full-scale war. The strikes hit just before dawn today, Tuesday, February 3rd, and focused heavily on energy infrastructure. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling it outright terrorism, coming less than a day before U.S.-brokered peace talks are due to start in Abu Dhabi.
You called this one of the largest barrages so far. What made this attack stand out from previous waves?
Two things really stand out: the sheer volume of drones and missiles, and the concentration on the power grid during a brutal cold snap. According to the Associated Press, in reporting carried by the Las Vegas Sun, this is the 9th major assault on Ukraine's power system since October of last year. They say Russia went after thermal plants, substations, transformers, turbines, and generators, especially those run by DTEK, Ukraine's biggest private energy company. So this was not just about hitting scattered targets. It looks like part of a sustained campaign to break the grid.
And that cold you mentioned is extreme. How bad are conditions on the ground, and why does hitting the grid right now matter so much?
Parts of Ukraine are in an exceptional deep freeze. France 24 reports that in Kyiv, overnight temperatures fell to about minus 17 degrees Celsius, roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit, and in the northeastern Kharkiv region, the lows were even harsher, near minus 23. When you knock out power and heating in that kind of cold, it is not just uncomfortable, it can quickly become life-threatening. Zelensky said on his official Telegram channel, quote, "Taking advantage of the coldest days of winter to terrorize people is more important to Russia than diplomacy," end quote.
In Kyiv specifically, what kind of damage and disruption are people waking up to this morning?
The Las Vegas Sun, drawing on local officials, says more than 1,170 apartment blocks in Kyiv lost heating after the strikes, undoing weeks of repair work. Residents are being directed back to so-called invincibility points, emergency warming centers, set up in schools, gyms, and public buildings. France 24 reports at least 3 people were wounded in Kyiv, with fires breaking out in residential buildings and damage to a kindergarten and a gas station, images captured by Agence France-Presse photographers. You have this scene of firefighters working in sub-zero temperatures while families huddle in dark, freezing apartments.
And beyond the capital, how are other regions faring, especially places like Kharkiv and Odessa that have already been hit hard this winter?
In the Kharkiv region, where that minus 23-degree cold was recorded, the Las Vegas Sun reports at least 2 people wounded by shelling. Authorities there deliberately shut off heat to more than 800 homes to prevent the entire system from freezing and collapsing, sending people to warming centers instead. France 24 adds that in the southern Odessa region, Russian strikes hit energy facilities and worsened blackouts, just as frost tightened its grip. DTEK, the energy company, confirmed that several of its thermal plants took direct hits, describing Russia's goal as causing, quote, maximum destruction, end quote, to leave Ukrainians in the dark.
There was also mention of a cultural site being struck in Kyiv. What happened there?
One of the more symbolic blows was to the National Museum of the History of Ukraine in the Second World War, which sits below the giant Motherland Monument in Kyiv. The Hall of Fame there, a space dedicated to those who fought Nazi Germany, was damaged in the overnight attack. Ukraine's culture minister, Tetiana Berezhna, told reporters, as quoted by the Las Vegas Sun, that the strike was, quote, symbolic and cynical, end quote, because it hit a place honoring 20th century resistance, while similar aggression plays out in the 21st century. It feeds into a wider Ukrainian narrative that Russia is trying not just to break infrastructure, but to erase memory and morale.
You mentioned this is all happening on the eve of new peace talks. Remind us, what's supposed to happen tomorrow in Abu Dhabi?
Starting tomorrow and running into Thursday, the second round of trilateral discussions is scheduled in Abu Dhabi with Ukrainian, Russian, and U.S. representatives. Local Ukrainian outlets like the Kyiv Independent, along with WKYC in Cleveland and Yahoo's news service, say the agenda includes the status of Russian-occupied territories in Donetsk and Luhansk and ideas for an energy ceasefire. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who led the first round in late January, previously described the talks as constructive, but admitted there were no major breakthroughs after a year of effort. These meetings were originally planned for February 1st and had to be pushed back, so the timing of this massive strike, less than 24 hours before they restart, is widely seen as a deliberate signal.
In the lead-up to these talks, there was talk of a pause in Russian strikes. Was there really a ceasefire of sorts, and what went wrong?
President Donald Trump told reporters and conservative outlets last week that he had personally convinced Vladimir Putin to halt attacks on Kyiv and some other cities until February 1st because of the extreme cold. He framed it as a humanitarian, weather-related pause. But the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, clarified the very next day that any lull was a one-week, so-called gesture of goodwill tied to negotiations, starting around January 24th and ending on February 1st, not open-ended. Independent outlets like the Moscow Times and the Washington Post point out that by Moscow's own timeline, the pause had already expired before last night's barrage, and there seems to have been a serious communication gap between Washington and Moscow about how long it would last.
How is Russia justifying this new wave of strikes now that the pause has clearly ended?
Russia's Ministry of Defense claims the February 3rd attacks were retaliation for what it calls Ukrainian terrorist strikes on civilian sites in Russian territory between February 1st and today. Reporting from the Moscow Times and the outlet news.az says Moscow cites a Ukrainian drone hitting a residential house in the city of Stary Oskol in Belgorod region, killing 2 civilians. They also point to temporary closures of 5 southern Russian airports due to Ukrainian drone activity and some damage to property in the Krasnodar and Bryansk regions, with civilians reportedly injured. In Russia's telling, this massive response is framed as punishing Ukraine for targeting ordinary Russians.
And what do independent analysts say about Ukraine's actions in that same period? Were they going after civilians?
Groups like the Institute for the Study of War and the Conflict Intelligence Team, whose work is summarized by Forbes and Ukrainian outlet Kyiv Independent, say Ukraine largely focused on military targets in those days. They document Ukrainian strikes on a TOS-1A heavy flamethrower system and an electronic warfare station near Terbreno in Belgorod region, plus a drone control point and an engineer-sapper repair base near Rozivka in occupied Zaporizhzhia. A partisan group called Atesh also claimed it had sabotaged a Russian communications tower on Crimea's Arabat Spit. Analysts do acknowledge the Stary Oskol incident happened but suggest it may have involved a misfired or intercepted drone, and they note that on February 1st itself, Russian drones killed a dozen or more DTEK energy workers in a bus strike in Dnipropetrovsk region and hit a maternity hospital in Zaporizhzhia, which Zelensky points to as evidence that Moscow is hardly in a position to lecture on protecting civilians.
How have Ukraine's allies responded so far, especially with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte actually in Kyiv during all of this?
It was a dramatic backdrop for his visit. The Yakima Herald Republic, drawing on Wire reports, notes that NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, arrived in Kyiv only hours after the missiles and drones hit, calling it Russia's record missile barrage. In a speech to Ukraine's parliament carried by several European broadcasters, Rutte said, quote, "Your security is our security. Your peace is our peace. And it must be lasting." End quote. He also stressed that NATO countries have supplied about 3/4 of Ukraine's frontline missiles and around 90% of its air defense systems since last summer, and pledged that support would continue quickly and consistently.
And from Washington, how is the Trump administration reacting as it tries to mediate these talks?
According to coverage on Fox News and Canada's CBC, President Trump tried to project optimism, saying today he expects, quote, "good news," end quote, from the Abu Dhabi talks despite the fresh barrage. He confirmed that his envoy Steve Witkoff is still heading there and described both sides as, in his words, tired of war. Ukrainian officials, talking to outlets like Kyiv Post and The Guardian, say their delegation will still attend but will adjust its strategy, and they underline they will not concede on core issues like sovereignty over occupied territories. Zelensky has warned that the strikes show Moscow is prioritizing terror and escalation over honest diplomacy.
Let's talk about the legal side now. With power plants and heating systems hit in the dead of winter, are we looking at potential war crimes here?
A growing number of legal experts and human rights groups say yes. Human Rights Watch and the UN's Human Rights Office have long argued that repeatedly targeting energy infrastructure in sub-zero conditions, when civilian survival clearly depends on it, likely violates international humanitarian law. The Rome Statute and the Geneva Conventions require distinction between military and civilian targets, proportionality, and a concrete military advantage. Knocking out heat for millions in -20 temperatures just before peace talks is hard to justify under those standards. The International Criminal Court has already issued warrants in 2024 for senior Russian officials over earlier grid attacks, and legal analysts at West Point and on the site Legal Tools argue that this looks like part of a systematic campaign, which makes it easier to prosecute as crimes against humanity, not just isolated incidents.
How does this compare to earlier cases, like NATO's strikes on power stations in Serbia back in the late 1990s?
That comparison is coming up a lot. During the 1999 Kosovo conflict, NATO used so-called graphite bombs to temporarily short-circuit parts of Serbia's grid, and a UN tribunal later judged those strikes as generally lawful because they were designed to be reversible and tightly focused on military command structures. What Russia is doing in Ukraine, according to analyses cited by the Jerusalem Post and the Washington Post, involves high-explosive missiles and drones intended to physically destroy plants, transformers, and distribution nodes, knowing that civilians will be left without heat, water, and medical services in lethal cold. That mix of timing, scale, and apparent intent to spread terror pushes it much closer to the pattern condemned at Nuremberg, where deliberately depriving populations of essentials for survival was treated as a crime.
Stepping back from the law for a moment, what does this barrage tell us about where the war stands as it nears the 4-year mark?
Russia's early lightning offensive in 2022 failed, but it has slowly adjusted to a grinding war of attrition. France 24, citing data from the Institute for the Study of War and Agence France Presse, says Russian forces captured about 481 square kilometers in January alone, roughly double what they took in December, though those are still modest gains in a huge country. The winter strikes on infrastructure seem aimed at wearing down Ukrainians' will to keep fighting more than seizing new territory. And with the invasion's 4th anniversary coming up on February 24th, the gap remains wide. Ukraine insists on full sovereignty and security guarantees, while Russia still demands control over large parts of the Donbass.
As these Abu Dhabi talks approach, what are negotiators actually trying to tackle, and how does last night's attack complicate that?
According to reporting from the Washington Post and the think tank Critical Threats, U.S. officials have floated a 20-point framework that includes ideas like an energy ceasefire, limited buffer zones, and phased withdrawals or demilitarized areas. There had been talk of at least getting to a pause in attacks on critical infrastructure, while broader issues are hammered out. This barrage essentially undercuts that, signaling that Russia sees the grid as a legitimate battlefield tool, especially in winter. European and Asian outlets from Euractiv to India's Hindustan Times also note that every new round of strikes hardens public opinion in Ukraine and Europe, making big political compromises even harder to sell at home.
Before we let you go, what should we be watching most closely over the next couple of days?
The first big question is whether all three delegations actually sit down in Abu Dhabi tomorrow, and if so, whether they can at least agree on some humanitarian measures like localized ceasefires or protection of the grid. Military analysts will be watching to see if last night's barrage was a one-off message or the start of another sustained winter campaign against infrastructure. Inside Ukraine, the immediate concerns are very practical. Can engineers restore heat and power before the next cold wave? And will air defense stockpiles, supplied largely by NATO countries, hold up under repeated assaults? And globally, we will see whether this latest escalation triggers any new sanctions or legal steps, especially from European governments that see Ukraine's security as directly tied to their own.
A lot to watch in the hours before those talks are supposed to begin. Ethan, thanks for breaking all of that down. A major immigration decision out of Washington is giving many Haitian families a sudden sigh of relief. Chloe, bring us up to speed on what this federal judge did yesterday.
Grace, yesterday, February 2nd, a federal judge in Washington, Judge Anna Reyes, issued an 83-page order that stopped the Trump administration from ending temporary protected status, or TPS, for Haitians, at least for now. According to CNN and the Associated Press, this came just hours before those protections were supposed to lapse at midnight tonight. Her ruling basically says the Department of Homeland Security's move to end TPS for roughly 350,000 Haitians is, quote, null, void, and of no legal effect, end quote. That means, as of this morning, Haitian TPS holders can keep working legally and cannot be deported while the case moves forward.
So what exactly is TPS, and why does it matter so much to this community?
TPS is a special humanitarian protection under federal immigration law that lets people from certain crisis-hit countries live and work here temporarily because it is too dangerous to go back. Haiti was first designated after the devastating 2010 earthquake, and that status has been renewed over and over as conditions worsened. NPR reminds us it does not create a path to citizenship, and people with serious criminal records are excluded, so these are vetted long-term residents. Many have U.S.-born children, mortgages, and jobs in healthcare, education, and other essential sectors.
And what were the main reasons Judge Reyes gave for stepping in at the last minute like this?
She focused on two big issues: grace procedure and prejudice. According to coverage in the Washington Post and CNN Politics, she found the administration likely broke the rules by skipping required fact-finding about conditions in Haiti and by ignoring input from agencies like the State Department. She also said the plaintiffs are likely to prove that racial animus toward Black and non-white immigrants influenced the decision, which makes it unconstitutional under long-standing Supreme Court standards. Because of those concerns, she said the decision to terminate TPS was arbitrary, capricious, and could not stand while the lawsuit continues.
You mentioned racial animus. That is a strong term. What evidence did she point to on that front?
Much of it came straight from public statements by top officials. Judge Reyes highlighted social media posts from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem last December, where, as NPR describes, she referred to immigrants from Haiti and other countries as, quote, killers, leeches, or entitlement junkies, end quote, and demanded a travel ban from, quote, every damn country that has been flooding our nation, end quote. She also looked at former comments from President Trump about Haitians, including that infamous shithole countries remark in 2018, his suggestion that Haitians, quote, probably have AIDS, end quote, and his recent false claims that Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, were eating people's pets. The judge said those statements fit a broader pattern of hostility toward Haitians and other Black migrants that cannot be separated from this policy choice.
How unusual is it for a judge to lean so heavily on that kind of rhetoric in an immigration case?
It is not unprecedented, but it is significant. During Trump's first term, judges in cases like Ramos versus Nielsen and Saget versus Trump also cited his derogatory remarks about non-white countries when they blocked earlier attempts to end TPS. And legal scholars told Bloomberg Law that Judge Reyes is building on that line of thinking. She is drawing on a Supreme Court framework dating back to a 1977 case known as Arlington Heights, which says courts can infer discriminatory intent from things like official statements, abrupt process changes, and the impact on a minority group. So while courts usually give presidents a lot of leeway on immigration, this opinion signals that explicit bias can still cross a constitutional line.
Let's talk about those process problems you mentioned. What did the judge say DHS actually failed to do?
Under the immigration law that creates TPS, the Homeland Security Secretary has to regularly review conditions in the home country, consult with other agencies, and decide whether dangerous circumstances still exist. Judge Reyes found that Secretary Noem's November decision glossed over that entire review, even as the U.S. State Department was warning Americans not to travel to Haiti at all. CNN's reporting notes that Reyes criticized DHS for not seriously engaging with the State Department's recent Level 4 Do Not Travel alert from just late last week, which described gunfire, kidnappings, and lockdowns. She basically said the secretary treated TPS like a purely discretionary political tool when Congress actually put concrete guardrails on how these decisions must be made.
So how bad are things in Haiti right now, according to those outside reports the judge says were ignored?
They are dire. The United Nations documented more than 8,000 killings inside Haiti last year alone, the worst on record, largely because armed gangs now control most of the capital, Port-au-Prince. Human Rights Watch has reported that sexual violence has tripled since 2022, and the UN Migration Agency says more than 1.4 million people have been displaced inside the country. On top of that, according to the UN's Food Security Program, over half the population faces acute hunger because gangs are blocking roads and aid convoys.
And yet the administration argued conditions had improved enough to end TPS. How are they making that case?
Homeland Security officials, including spokesperson Tricia McLaughlin, have said repeatedly that TPS was never meant to become, in their words, de facto asylum or permanent status. In interviews cited by CNN and NPR, McLaughlin argued that Haiti has seen, quote, positive developments, end quote, and pointed to a United Nations-backed mission that is supposed to help Haitian police push back gangs. That mission, led by Kenya with about 5,500 troops authorized, was approved back in September. But, as the Washington Post reports, deployment keeps slipping and is now not expected until April, which Judge Reyes said does nothing to address the immediate risks people would face if sent back right now.
How is the Trump administration responding to yesterday's injunction?
They are furious and promising a fast appeal. McLaughlin called the ruling, quote, lawless activism, end quote, and said the administration will take the fight to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals and, if necessary, to the Supreme Court, according to CBS News and the Miami Herald. Their argument is that a humanitarian program created after an earthquake 15 years ago has been stretched beyond recognition and that the executive branch, not judges, should decide when it ends. So even though Haitian families woke up this morning still protected, they know this is not the final word.
You mentioned this is part of a broader strategy on immigration. How does this TPS fight fit into President Trump's second-term agenda?
It is one piece of a much larger push to drastically shrink legal protections and ramp up deportations. The administration has already moved to roll back TPS for other groups, from Venezuelans and Ukrainians to Central Americans and some African nationals, and it has pushed for large-scale interior enforcement. Policy analysts told NPR that targeting TPS is symbolic because many of these communities have been here for more than a decade, deeply rooted in local economies and schools. By going after them, the White House is signaling that almost no form of humanitarian relief is safe from review.
Let's talk about the people behind the lawsuit. Who brought this case, and what were they arguing?
The case is called Miot versus Trump, and it was filed by 5 Haitian TPS holders and advocacy groups like the National TPS Alliance. NPR and WLRN explain that the plaintiffs include a neuroscientist, a software engineer, a registered nurse, and other professionals who have built lives here under this program. They argued that ending TPS now would likely expose them and their families to death or serious harm from violence, disease, or starvation in Haiti. They also said the government was ignoring their clean records and contributions because of stereotypes about Haitians as criminals or burdens.
What are we hearing from Haitian communities around the country now that this ruling has come down?
There is huge relief, but also a lot of anxiety about what comes next. In South Florida, which has one of the largest Haitian communities, groups like the Florida Immigrant Coalition told CNN this is a critical victory that prevents devastating harm, at least for the moment. The coalition's executive director, Tessa Petit, who was born in Haiti, said this gives families a chance to breathe and plan, especially parents of U.S. citizen kids. Local officials in Miami have also stressed that hospitals, nursing homes, and schools rely heavily on Haitian TPS workers.
You mentioned Springfield, Ohio earlier, where those wild rumors about Haitians started. What does this decision mean on the ground there?
Springfield has become a flashpoint because Trump repeatedly claimed, without evidence, that Haitian newcomers were eating cats and dogs there, which local police and reporters have debunked. NPR and Ohio public radio outlets say those comments triggered bomb threats, kids skipping school, and a climate of fear. After the injunction, a Haitian community leader named Rose Tamar Joseph said, quote, "We can breathe for a little bit," end quote, but emphasized the fear has not disappeared. Pastors and organizers are holding Know Your Rights sessions, and some families are preparing legal documents in case parents are detained and children need guardians.
How about the legal history here? Have courts stopped TPS terminations like this before?
Yes, this is not the first time judges have blocked attempts to cut off protections for Haitians and other TPS groups. Back in Trump's first term, federal judges in New York and California halted earlier terminations, saying the administration likely acted with racial bias and ignored evidence of ongoing danger, and the Biden administration later dropped those appeals. More recently, last summer, another judge in Brooklyn temporarily stopped Secretary Noam from speeding up Haiti's TPS expiration to August of last year, saying the rush would cause irreparable harm. So there is a pattern of courts stepping in when they see sudden, poorly explained reversals that affect hundreds of thousands of people.
Looking ahead now, what happens next in this case, and how quickly could things change again?
The first step will be an appeal to the D.C. Circuit, which the Justice Department could file within days. The government is expected to ask for an emergency stay, essentially a request to put Judge Reyes's order on hold while the appeal is heard. Legal experts told NPR that could be decided in a matter of weeks, and if the stay is granted, TPS could suddenly be back on the chopping block even before the full case is resolved. If the appeals court ultimately splits with other circuits on how far the Homeland Security Secretary's power goes, the Supreme Court could take it up late this year.
For families listening, who may be directly affected, what does this ruling actually mean for their day-to-day lives right now?
As of this morning, their existing TPS status and work permits stay valid, and they should not be targeted for deportation solely because their TPS was supposed to end tonight. WLRN reports that federal agencies have been instructed to keep processing work authorization tied to TPS while the injunction is in place. Advocacy organizations are urging people not to panic, to keep their documents current, and to attend legal clinics to understand their options. But they are also warning that folks need to be ready for rapid changes if an appeals court or the Supreme Court steps in.
Big picture, Chloe, what does this fight over Haitian TPS tell us about where U.S. immigration policy is headed?
It shows how volatile and politicized the system has become, even for people who have followed every rule for years. On one side, you have an administration that sees TPS as overused and wants to pare it back aggressively. On the other, you have courts saying humanitarian commitments and anti-discrimination principles still matter. According to analysis from The Guardian and the Brennan Center, Judge Reyes's focus on racial animus could shape how future immigration policies are written and defended, forcing officials to be more careful about both their language and their evidence. For Haitian families, though, it boils down to something much simpler: whether they will be allowed to stay in the only stable home many of their children have ever known.
A lot at stake, and this is clearly not over. Chloe, thanks for walking us through it.
Thanks, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Iran and the United States will restart high-stakes nuclear talks in Istanbul this Friday, with Turkish diplomats playing host and mediator. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has told Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi to seek just and equitable terms with U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff as a U.S. naval armada led by the USS Abraham Lincoln nears the region, and President Trump warns bad things will follow failure. After a 12-day war in 2025 and enrichment now at 60%, Washington is pressing for a permanent halt to enrichment and ballistic missile work, while Israel's red lines and Arab mediators crowd the negotiating table. The Justice Department's long-sealed Jeffrey Epstein archive has landed with a thud, then a legal dud. Roughly 3.5 million pages of files, images, and videos were released under the bipartisan Epstein Files Transparency Act, including FBI summaries and photos referencing figures such as Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and former Prince Andrew, none charged based solely on these records. But sloppy redactions briefly exposed the names and nude images of nearly 100 survivors, forcing thousands of files offline and prompting calls for court oversight, tougher privacy protocols, and the release of millions more still withheld documents on Epstein's money trail. On the trade front, Washington and New Delhi are trying to turn tariff wars into truce talks. President Trump and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi have unveiled a deal cutting U.S. duties on Indian goods to a reciprocal 18%, down from levels as high as 50%. In exchange, India pledges a $500 billion Buy American binge in energy, tech, and farm goods, and to shut off imports of Russian oil. Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal says negotiators are threading in protections for sensitive dairy and agriculture as India, fresh from free trade pacts with the EU and UK, sews up its role as a global manufacturing hub. In Miami, the phrase "taxing the government" has a new twist. President Trump, his sons, and the Trump Organization are suing the IRS and Treasury for $10 billion over contractor Charles Littlejohn's leaks of Trump tax returns, alleging agencies failed to take mandatory precautions and inflicted significant and irreparable reputational harm. Ethics experts say the case tests the guardrails of the executive branch, since Trump's own appointees would normally defend the government or cut any enormous settlement far beyond standard $1,000 per leak remedies, leaving taxpayers potentially footing the bill. And in Texas politics, a deep red district just turned a surprising shade of Remit blue. Democrat Taylor Remit, an Air Force veteran and union president, flipped long Republican Texas Senate District 9 around Fort Worth, defeating Republican Lee Wamsgans with about 57% of the vote, despite being outspent by roughly $2 million. The seat, vacated by Republican Kelly Hancock and carried by Trump by 17 points in 2024, saw nearly a 30-point swing toward Democrats. Analysts call it a political earthquake that could rattle Tarrant County suburbs like Keller all the way into the 2026 midterms. Voters, meanwhile, are bracing for more aftershocks to come. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.